oops. All right, my animation's not working well. Anyway, so we have this on the link down below as a policy brief about greenhouse gas. So this figure in the middle is our planning process. So it's a more generic process. And then on the side, we've kind of annotated it with these climate touch points. So at the very top, you start with sort of, regulations. We have things like the executive order, some legislation that said you must create a path to greenhouse gas reductions of 80% by 2050. Those kind of things set the stage. And then at the strategic level for emissions, we have our statewide transportation strategy set back in 2013. As you move down, and there's also climate smart strategies for local areas. As you move down to that tactical T level of the storm diagram, we define long range plans and what projects would be in there. Also the STIP program or local funding programs, state and local funding programs. We've added some climate lens to those. And then as you get down to the operational level, we're now in sort of individual projects like we'll hear today from the Interstate Bridge Program. And then there's reporting and monitoring, and performance measures are part of that CFAC rulemaking. You can see in the star number 3 over there. So that's a general planning process, and we've created some new touch points. The green ones identified on here are really for greenhouse gas reduction. The yellow ones are for our adaptation and resilience. So there's actually a whole sort of strategy and roadmap for that side of the house as our climate is changing. So today we're going to really, we're trying to connect all these dots. Actually, a lot of the dots have popped up over the last couple of years, and we're trying to make sure that they all are smoothly syncing together. So today we'll talk about, start with number 1 down there. Jillian will tell us about, how to plan for the EV chargers. And then number 2 will be talking about our project level work that sort of started at the funding program STIP and is now moving into project level for NEPA projects. And then thirdly, the climate friendly and equitable communities has both a touch point at those long range plans and then performance measures as well. So with that, I'll move it over to Natalie, our lead there on project level greenhouse gas analysis.
Thank you, Tara. So let me get to the right slide.
For a lot of you probably know, Natalie is our NEPA coordinator here at ODOT, and so many of you have probably coordinated with her. Super helpful person to keep us on all the regulations and how they're evolving over time.
So I work on greenhouse gas analysis, and in this presentation, I'm going to go over some of the current rules that are reshaping how we analyze greenhouse gases in NEPA. And I'm also going to share an NCHRP study that I am part of that is creating greenhouse gas guidance and climate change guidance. And then Tara's going to introduce an overview of how we are going to change the way we do project level analysis based on the STIP level greenhouse gas analysis that ODOT worked on in the past couple of years for the 24-27 STIP. Then I'll go through some of the highlights of that STIP process, like the traffic data, the emissions modeling, and the results.
Natalie, are you sharing your screen yet?
Am I not?
No, we're not seeing it.
Okay. I thought I was. Here we go.
Not yet. That looks like it's
good. And
it's a nice lighthouse.
Thank you.
There we go. All right. So moving on from there.
And now. Okay.
All right.
So
That's great.
I'm going to start with the regulations. So the main reason that we have done greenhouse gas analysis is because for federally funded projects, because of NEPA, we are required to look at environmental impacts, and greenhouse gases is one of those impacts that is contributing to climate change. ODOT has been including greenhouse analysis in our NEPA analysis for over 15 years. The methods have changed over time, and they'll probably continue to change, and the methods is what we're talking about today. But the most recent rule change was earlier this year. The CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, came out with a new greenhouse gas and climate change guidance. And the main parts about that guidance are that they do want us to calculate greenhouse gas emissions associated with our built project and comparing it to no built. And they want the reporting to discuss the changes to climate change that the project may cause, and lastly, the effect that climate change would have on our project. And I didn't write it here, but we are also needing to look at equity issues surrounding our project. The next federal guidance is that the main tool that we use to calculate tailpipe emissions is EPA's tool MOVES. And EPA developed a guidance in 2016 on that tool, and that's the best available right now. It creates emission rates and can also develop your inventory for a particular project. The big rule that has created this new approach to STIP work, greenhouse gas analysis, is the executive order of 2020 that required ODOT to come up with methods to analyze projects in the STIP. And the last rule I wanted to bring up is HB 4139 that is requiring ODOT to also look at embodied emissions, the life cycle emissions, so looking at construction materials and operations. ODOT will start to collect environmental product declaration information, which is like a CAN label on greenhouse gases, and there should be enough data in the database in 2025 to help us with greenhouse gas accounting of materials. So next, I wanted to share about this research project that I've been working on. It's going to be complete early next year. We've been working on it for a few years, but when it was first proposed, there was no guidance on how to analyze greenhouse gases and climate change in NEPA and also at the planning level. And so there was really a need. There's still no specific guidance for transportation, and we're hoping the feds come out with something soon. But this study started by surveying all the DOTs to see what they're doing. And from those surveys and pair exchanges, they have developed lists and links to tools and methods for greenhouse gas, climate, and equity analysis. And the guidance document includes things about life cycle and the need to look at both tailpipe emissions and construction emissions, and also to account for emissions prior to the gas station in refining and transporting of fuel. It also looks at transit, operation, and upstream electricity. The guidance covers the new regulation that the CEQ released this year, and it includes information about how you could develop your own policies, mitigation measures, reduction strategies, And finally, it includes implementation challenges and solutions. So that's going to be available starting early next year. And I will give Tara the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to pop in here. So Natalie has set the stage for all these sort of new requirements in this new space. And particularly we were tasked with the executive order that said you must analyze the GHG emissions from the STIP, the 3-year funding program that we do at the state. So we stepped back and really established an Oregon vision for where we wanted to go with this project level analysis, knowing that NCHRP projects should come in here and help us. But, GHG is not the same as air quality. And so we wanted to sort of understand and tackle this in a way. So we're not quite there, but this is sort of our vision. And I think the STIP, this last STIP cycle has been the most recent, or the first one that we really tried this on. And there's a lot on this slide, so I'm just going to kind of go through the various steps, and then Natalie's going to spend some time in each of those pieces to put more flesh on the bones there. So overall, though, first we would start with your traditional, and this is, most projects would go through this process. There's some other projects that might do other things, but the big projects will have their traditional travel demand models where they will project that VMT. So that's really step one. And we're looking at that change in VMT. And then step 2 is, okay, well, what are the emissions for that VMT? This is typically, a DEQ space, and they help us define what goes into that MOVES model. A lot of places don't have a MOVES model, so we're trying to get some emission rates, like a lookup table. You could go out to a website and get that, the emission rates. Traditionally, that's been at a tailpipe level, right? Because air quality, you care about tailpipe. That's where the health impact is if that tailpipe is right next to, people walking on the street. But for greenhouse gas, we know that it's the accumulated emissions that in the atmosphere that really have the impact on climate. So we need to add to that sort of gray tailpipe that comes out of MOVES some upstream emissions that happen to get to that tailpipe. First is the upstream of, refining and getting that fuel out of the ground. That's the sort of dark blue there. And then the light blue is the electricity that we're using with our increasing electrification of the fleet. So that will change over time. And so we're trying to capture that and work with DEQ to do that. And that's very sensitive to the vehicle type, the speed bin, and obviously the year as we electrify. And we want to really reflect the Oregon's latest programs on regulations that have just come out in the last year or two. So all this stuff is a big area that we've been working with DEQ. So once we have those emission rates, we can apply them to the VMT. And so that step 3 is to get that same sort of chart, but at the emission rate or the total emissions. And we can look at a build versus a no build scenario. That will transition over into our table there of user emissions, who's using the facility. Secondly, step 4 is really coming in with saying, well, we need to build those facilities and maintain those facilities. And so we're coming in with what are the embodied emissions within those materials and methods to do that. And we're so far really focused on the construction, but would like to bring more maintenance in as well. And I'll talk a little bit about how that connects to our goals, but key to that was getting to this life cycle and cumulative, which is what our greenhouse gas goals are also set in. So with that, I think we'll go into each of those a little bit more detail. Natalie, if you could start stepping us through those.
Okay, so the big push that we're trying to make today is about life cycle emissions and how important it is to include emissions beyond the tailpipe. This is just a list starting from extraction, refining, and transport to tailpipe emissions. We aren't including starting and idling emissions just yet, but those are part of the puzzle. And then construction emissions, material emissions, and maintenance emissions. Okay. So when we were starting to think about how we are going to assess projects in the STIP, we didn't have as much information as we usually have when we do NEPA. and we're further along in a project. So we needed to think of ways to come up with traffic data with basically just a project description, mileposts, location. And so we had many methods. The table on the left kind of highlights 3 of our main methods. The first is to use the statewide integrated model, as well as using HERS for our bigger projects like adding new roads. We needed those models to create traffic VMT by road type and by speed, because that data is really essential to calculating greenhouse gases. For smaller projects like bike ped facilities, there was a pre-existing tool for CMAQ, which is the congestion mitigation and air quality tools that Federal Highways developed. And then for some other projects like curb ramps and EV charging, we developed some novel calculations, which we aren't going to go into right now. Overall, in the table on the right, we analyzed 123 projects. 30 had the detailed swim HERS analysis, and the rest used the other methods that I discussed. So overall, our methodology for greenhouse gases was first to develop traffic data. And this data, we wanted build and no build, and we wanted to look at multiple years so we could calculate that cumulative accumulation of emissions over time from years 2025 through 2050. Then we wanted to calculate the emissions, and again, we needed the emissions that matched our traffic data that we were collecting. So we wanted it by speed, by the fuel, by the vehicle, by the year. We needed to, and we also wanted to account for the change in fleet over time, and I'll talk about that more in another slide. We wanted to apply a fuel factor to account for before the gas station emissions. And we also wanted to try and include electricity for all the EVs that are going to quickly escalate in numbers. And the last part is to look at construction emissions, both the materials and the equipment and the operation. Tara is going to cover this one.
Yeah, so this is just a little bit more of a deep dive on that first step of identifying the traffic modeling. The chart on the left actually talks about the whole thing, but that first part in the blue is really the SWIM, the statewide integrated model, and HERS, which is a model that gets a little bit more into operational projects. Those were done in tandem because they're complementary. SWIM really gets you to the adjacency and across the whole network, whereas HERS is a little more isolated to a particular project segment. And so we had to synchronize those 2 models, so that's why that seems a little bit complex in that top blue box. And then after that, there's a small blue box on the left, the HERS post processor, and that was really important to add 2 elements that are, we know that the emission rates are very sensitive to both speed and vehicle classification, and so that post processor really helped us out with that. One of the key things in it is converting the average speed that you get out of a travel model into a distribution of speed. And this is using the SHARP2, what is SHARP2? Highway Research Program, Strategic Highway Research Program methods that came out several years ago to provide that more robust speed. And it's typically used in reliability, but in this case, we were just getting a more robust distribution of speed so we could capture things like congestion impacts that might be more subtle than overall VMT impacts. It also assists with the breakdown of vehicle type classifications. Trucks, we can have, typically more like 3 times the emission rates of passenger vehicles. So it's important to break down our VMT into those different categories. And so you know, the traffic output overall, as Natalie has mentioned, we needed to be sensitive to vehicle types. So there's 3 vehicle types in there. Needed to be sensitive to speed, so that VMT is binned into 16 speed bins, and it needs to be sensitive to the fuel type. So whether it's gasoline, diesel, ethanol, and so forth, and electric for sure. And also, because we know that we're in a transition space, we needed to not just grab, you know, the base year or opening year of a project and the long-term out year. We needed some intermediate years, so we have every 5 years done, and we can be a little bit more linear in terms of interpolating the VMT side, so that we can apply that to emission rates that we know are dynamically different over this time period. All right, back to you, Natalie.
Thank you. So we worked very closely with DEQ to develop a prediction of future emission rates. Traditionally, when we do air quality analysis in NEPA, we assume that the fleet is the same as it is in existing conditions. But we know that's not true based on all of our vehicle and fuel regulations, both nationwide and in Oregon. And so DEQ has done modeling to predict its future fuel and vehicle distribution, EV, and the EV transition. So we were able to get this data broken down by passenger vehicle, medium, and heavy truck. And we were provided this data at various intervals. The study that DEQ did only went out to year 2035. So although data is available statewide out further, we were recommended to pause our fleet change at year 2035. So in the first passenger chart, you can see the gray is the increasing EV population. The gray is also for medium trucks, and the heavy trucks is the yellow. And so our analysis included the change to EVs over time, which would make our greenhouse gas emissions smaller than if we didn't include the EV transition. In order to calculate EV emissions, we needed to be able to know what the consumption curve was, and we needed to know what the change in power was at each of the speed bins, 16 speed bins that we were using for our traffic data. And so we were able to find some data for both cars, passenger vehicles, medium and heavy trucks, and the consumption curves are shown here, where the highest, the green, is for heavy trucks, and the red is medium, and then autos is the blue. So we basically multiplied our vehicle VMT by these consumption power values, and then by the carbon intensity. We used existing carbon intensity, but for future years, we used values from EIA energy, forgot what that stands for. In the newest version of MOVES that was released just last month, they introduced new ways to look at EVs, and so they will be able to provide the information in this chart, and so our methodology will be evolving yet again. This slide is talking about embodied emissions, and with regards to that new rule, HB 4139, asphalt, concrete, and steel greenhouse gas components will be logged and then available in our calculations. But for right now, we are using a tool from FHWA called ICE that looks at construction emissions, material emissions, and emissions from the delay related to construction activities. Tyria?
Right. So then, we get to what does this all mean and how do we connect it to our goals? So in the case of the STIP work that we did, that 3-year funding, we had, 100 and some projects that we looked at, both the user emissions, which you can see there was a drop of 500,000 metric tons, and the embodied materials, the construction materials that were used, which is a positive increase in greenhouse gas to incorporate those materials of 0.15 million metric tons. So we get this net of 0.37 million metric tons. And the question was, well, what does that mean? How do we set some context for that? So then we went back to, we have the statewide strategy, which is what the chart on the right shows. And you can find that on the website, at the bottom website there. So that has tracks our greenhouse gas goals and where we are relative to those. So the first line, the gold star, is where we want to be. And so from 1990, the y-axis there says, we're trying to get down to close to 80% reduction by 2050. So that's where we want to be. Where we actually are today in our projections forward is in the dark blue line. 5 years ago, we were on the dash blue line. So the big gain there has been with those DEQ requirements on the vehicle manufacturers that I put in the chat for Jillian's speech. So anyway, so we're down at the blue line. We want to go to the gold line. So the gap for us to reach our goals is that area between it. So if you think this is life cycle emissions, so yeah, we're in GHG world here, not air quality world. So life cycle, and we're going to accumulate it into the atmosphere over the course of these many years. That gray area is 73 million metric tons. So we're like, that's what we need to reduce over that time period. And the teal box on the left is saying that the STIP, this 3-year funding of 100 so projects, is getting chipping away at that in the right direction. And if you divide that out, it's about 0.5% in the direction of chipping away at that gray area. That is our gap to reach the greenhouse gas. So this was sort of our epiphany of, we can connect the results of what we do in our projects to how that's contributing towards us reaching our goals.
So this is a slide is really just to kind of go over projects that we believe the statewide greenhouse gas methods can be used on in the future. So the main things that are new are being able to use new traffic methods to calculate traffic at various speeds, to include life cycle emissions, and to include our changing fleet in the future. And this data will be provided by DEQ with emission rates by county by every 5 years. So the statewide greenhouse gas projects are typically going to be bigger projects that have capacity change or realignment or widened shoulders, but they're also going to be smaller projects that we want to capture because they're reducing emissions. But it might be at a collective level, like all of the bike ped facilities. And we hope that this presentation will help you kind of see how greenhouse gas analysis is moving in the future, and it can be used in our next STIP cycle for major projects and long-range planning. We might pause for questions, but the next presentation will be by Rebecca, and she is a consultant at WSP, and she has been working on the IBR project.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Yeah, I wanted to also give a shout out here to James Powell. He's our expert over at DEQ that's been helping to come up with these emission rates that reflect Oregon-specific policies And that's been moving pretty fast. So, and he's trying to do what, 26 counties, 36 counties in Oregon, you know, all the dimensions there, and Moves has just come out with Moves 4. So it's a wealth of data that he's trying to tackle to get us those emission rates that then fit into this overall process. And appreciate Rebecca that will tell us a bit in the future about how she's applying this in this dynamic world to a project that's a pretty massive one. But let's take a few questions. So Eric, you had your hand up there.
Thanks. Yes. And maybe this is better for offline to dig into it, but I guess just want to make sure I was understanding a couple pieces, because I think I heard earlier that there's sort of suggestion not to go past 2035 with some of those estimates, but then I think I saw them represented there, and then I saw your, the chart that's on the emissions website, that then has a real kind of neck narrowing, seemingly based on those emission profile changes past 2035. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm tracking sort of how you all are using that, which is less of a technical question for this group. And that's why, if you want to kick that off to a side conversation later, Tara.
Well, I'll give a high level and then hand it off to Natalie. I think we're just, those, the ink is barely dry on some of those new regulations, and we're still trying to figure out what the assumptions we should make. So I think it's a shortcoming in that space of what we could do. So I think what you saw was a bar for 2035 to 50. So it's just held constant during that period as opposed to evolving in that period. And I think
because it looked like it dropped down quite significantly in the passenger area. I saw it briefly. I didn't snap it, but so that's where it looked like there was an assumption, right? And I know 2035, the only EV for sale kicks in, but we also know I think it's about 14 years of turnover right now in the state. So it felt like a pretty quick jump from 70%, if I recall, to 50% there, and it looked like that then showed how we were getting there. So anyway, maybe more to dig into on the policy implications, right? Connections to vision eval and target setting, or where my head's at. But I know this is also a group of technicians more so that I'll leave other space for to dig into
I think
tools.
There's the rules come in and they're sales, and so there's the challenge of trying to move sales into what's on the road, which is that turnover.
Right.
And so by stopping it at 2035 in terms of what was on the road, we were not sort of catching the continued tail that would come in over the next 10 or 12 years as the fleet turnover happens and we all buy new vehicles. So I think we're a little bit shortcoming in our assumptions, and we'll hope to do those better in the next cycle. I don't know, Natalie, if you had anything to add there.
That takes care of what I had to say.